Welcome to this month's podcast, Psychic Steps, exploring important aspects in child therapy as it relates to the Jungian theory. Today we are going to talk about the ego, the child's ego, where does the child's ego fit into the psyche, as well as important aspects with reference to the ego development, ego strength, and a negativized ego. I want to remind you that if you are interested in learning more, you can visit my website at www.playtherapytraining.net for more information on workshops where these aspects that is discussed in the podcast is explored in much more depth and add on a lot of practical exercises where the theory and the practical is integrated. So let's talk about where does the child's ego fit into the structure of the psyche. The ego refers to all aspects that is conscious. Everything that is experienced on conscious level is referred to as the ego or the ego complex. The ego refers to the I or the part that you know of. It can be compared with like a flashlight in a dark room. The ego is not the psychic content upon which its light shines. The ego can only focus on or reflect what is in the beam. The ego is not able to see the bigger picture. The ego is seen as the center of consciousness in the child, and it is the subjective self of consciousness. The ego is the central organizing point of conscious awareness, and when a child is born, the ego is not yet formed. The unconscious of the child is very much part of the unconscious of the mother, and ego formation only takes place at around age 3.5 after centroversion and after the child has touched the true self deep inside for the first time. In order to function as human beings, we need a sense of what is or what is predictable, because without that, we lapse in psychic chaos. The ego is the psychic organ through which our realities are defined and maintained. The ego must be strong enough in therapy for the child to withstand what comes up from the unconscious. The ego must also be flexible enough to undergo alteration. The beam of the flashlight needs to be progressively increased without destroying the flashlight. The opposite of this is rigidity, and that would be where a child has a very rigid ego and the child cannot integrate polarities. I am reminded of a child that was very, very angry towards her stepfather. She was a teenager, and I asked her if she can think of one positive thing that the stepfather did. For example, he was dropping her off at school in the morning, or he sometimes dropped her off at her friends, and she just could not do that. She had a very rigid position that the stepfather was all bad. A positive mother-child relationship enables the development of a healthy ego. In other words, that first relationship, the child's relationship with the primary caregiver, or often the mother, forms a basis for the later development of a healthy and a strong, flexible ego. The positive mother-child relationship helps the child to develop emotional skills to integrate unconscious material that appears during the therapeutic process. Without these tools, a child will be battered by unconscious material. And I often see that in the playroom when I work with children, where a child's play, for example, in the sand tray or in the playroom, depicts total chaos. There's no structure, there's no organization, and that is exactly where a child sometimes takes monsters and dragons and like one child said, all the scary characters that is overwhelming the ego, and the play of the child is full of these characters that is scary and that is threatening, very vulnerable characters. It's very important to take note of this issue of, without a stable ego that can act as a container, the child is not able to control unconscious material that comes up and can flood the ego. The flooding of the ego might result in acting out on unconscious impulses. So a child might have acting out behavior at school, extreme aggressive behavior, vandalistic behavior, extreme meltdowns, or it might result in the development of a rigid personality structure. And as I've already explained, a rigid personality structure is where the ego is not able to become flexible, to become stronger, to expand, to integrate new aspects in consciousness, and to look at polarities. Also, a rigid ego is where the child cannot integrate shadow aspects out of his or her own unconscious. A connection to the ego is necessary for making anything that is unconscious conscious. So when a child has a rigid ego, the child is cut off from both inner and outer relatedness. The ego begins to form when the child has successfully developed a sense of separateness from the mother that starts at around 1 year, when the baby is around 1 year. When the child can have a relationship with the mother, and we know that happens more or less at age 18 months to 3, and when the child have a constellated self as the center of the personality. This is also called in the Jungian psychology centroversion, and in the next podcast I will expand on that more, how to see that. But ego development only takes place after the child had that first unconscious touch with the true self in the deepest unconscious. An integrated ego forms slowly over time, and there is also specific phases in terms of how it develops. So we first get the phase of animal vegetation, where you're going to see jungles and animals and plants and a lot of vegetation in a child's play. Then we get the magic warlike phase, which refers very much to the hero journey. And we will see a lot of warring sides, especially very prevalent in the sand scenes of boys in the primary school and from about 5 years of age. Then there's the solar warlike phase. So with boys, it's depicted in terms of battles, and girls, specifically pre-adolescent girls, are very fond of playing with horses. Horses also often depicting the instinctual spiritual energy within. The last phase is called the solar rational phase, and that is where the child has developed an ego that will be able to survive in the world. The child has developed an ego that is a freedom of will and functions independent from the unconscious. And this is often seen in sanctuary scenes as marketplace scenes. Marketplace mean the child has moved back to life as usual. So you might see in the scenes of girls, you might see dollhouse kind of house and rooms and nurturing and caretaking, or you might see a picture of a farm, different parts of the farm that are connected with each other in themes of nourishment and nurturing and peace and taking care of animals, or a zoo and so forth. So when the child's ego has not developed a strong connection with the self deeply inside the unconscious, so we refer to that as a weak ego self-access, the child will then have a negative self-image, And the way to cope with that in life will be to make use of exaggerated defense mechanisms. When we think about defense mechanisms, they can be distinguished between primitive defenses like fight, flight, freeze, submit, collapse, attach sometimes to cut off dissociation, and we can also look at more mature defenses such as somatization, where the child have a lot of physical symptoms without being emotionally aware of what the emotion is behind that. Or there can be the defense of denial, of minimization, it's not that bad, of repression, and a whole bunch of other defenses. So the weaker the child's ego strength and the poorer the child's connection with the true self, the more prevalent we will see defense mechanisms in the child's play and in the child's functioning. Denial would be, for example, I didn't do that. Minimization would be, for example, the trauma that took place wasn't that bad. The self, the true self, is experienced in childhood in relation to the parents, as initially the mother or the primary caregiver. The ego self-axis is most vulnerable to damage by adverse environmental influences, especially in early childhood, before the ego is formed that can contain some of what is happening. What is within and what is without cannot be distinguished by the young child. The inability to experience acceptance is experienced as a loss of acceptance by the true self. And when the ego self-access and the connection between the conscious part of the personality and the deepest unconscious of the personality is damaged, that results to an alienation between the conscious part and the true self. When a child experiences parental rejection, the projection of the parent's shadow on the child, that might cripple the child's psyche permanently. And we all know the extreme damaging effect of parental abandonment. And this is not just always overt abandonment, where the parent would be emotionally abusive and say to the child, for example, I wish you were never born, you are bothering me, I don't want to have you. It can also be in a lot of covert actions. For example, just not having time for the child, showing by favoring another child or another sibling, or by just ignoring the child, never validating the child, no mirroring for the child, not understanding the child's unique traits and characteristics, and give language to that. The opposite is also true. Acceptance of the child's self by the parents assists the development of the ego strength and stability. And this is the most important, that this need to happen from very young. Since the child is a baby, they need to be mirroring. The child need to get language and hear who they are and the acceptance of that, so that can move into self-acceptance. The ego of the child in the therapy process need to be strong enough to withstand what comes up from the unconscious. And the presence of you as a therapist provides added stability to this ego strength, because the therapist can act as the good mother or the good father and assist with that, acting as a container for what comes up from the child's unconscious. The therapist's presence can also often help to soften a very rigid ego, because of the experience of this positive unconditional acceptance throughout the therapy process. Traumatized children often struggle to accept the child's the therapist's unconditional acceptance, and it might take a very long time before they start to share more deep-seated pain and open up, even if it's just with projective activities and try work, dream analysis, and so. When there is an outer repair of the ego self function, as the therapist add as a positive parental figure, there simultaneously is also an inner repair of the relationship between the child's ego and the child's true self. A moderate amount of conflict with the environment that is referred to as optimal frustration is the best condition for the development of ego strength. This is very important. What is the difference between optimal frustration and traumatic failure? So, optimal frustration is not to do for a child what a child can do for him or herself. Optimal frustration is not to jump in and help a child if the child didn't ask for help, or to rescue a child from all amount of frustration and struggle that a child can experience. Optimal frustration is, for example, where a 7-year-old child calls the mum and asks her to help with homework like maths when the mum don't come immediately, but give the child a certain amount of time to try for him or herself. And once the child sort out, well, I can actually do this myself, that to lead to the development of tremendous ego strength. Whereas when the parent overprotect the child and jump in each time when the child asks for help, or do for a child what a child can do for themselves, the opposite is achieved. The child develop an internal model of I'm not good enough, I can't do it, I'm not strong enough, and learned helplessness. So the importance is that optimal frustration must link to the child's current age and level of ego strength. Traumatic failure is when we expect from a child to do what a child cannot achieve. For example, to leave a young child of 4 or 5 years old alone at home, or to expect a child of 4 years old to take care of a little baby brother or sister. And sometimes when a child's ego strength is low, is weak, because of being traumatized and going through traumatic situations, something that in the past could have been optimal frustration might now currently be traumatic failure. For example, the child just lost a mother through cancer, and because of the extreme loss and trauma that the child has been through, the 6-year-old child feels unable to dress themselves the next morning. So it's important for ego development to have a balanced amount of optimal frustration, but not to traumatize the child through expectations. When the ego is not strengthened by what happened, but rather injured and traumatized, later functioning of the ego might be radically impaired, and this might have long-lasting implications for the child's ability to master developmental tasks as the child grows older. I think, for example, at traumatic experiences, for example, child abuse, child neglect, or extreme trauma where the child is in life danger either once off or over and over again by being exposed to violence of a parental figure or someone that actually have to protect the child. Psychic catastrophes might lead to a permanently impaired ego, and as discussed in the self-care system and trauma in that podcast, a child can function well cognitively and go on well with outer situations like adapting at school and with friends. But in the less conscious part of the child, there might be extreme emotional turmoil and absence of an ego structure, and this creates severe dissociative tendencies. We often see that in the play of children, where on the outside the child can have a conversation, the child can tell what happened the last week, the child can tell about stuff at school, the child have good school marks. But once the child starts playing in the sand tray and building worlds in the sand tray or making drawings, the the turmoil and the chaos and the fragmentation and this dissociative tendencies is very clear. So the child might create extreme chaos in the sand tray, where maybe starting off by putting certain miniatures up straight and then just play dominoes and hit everything down. These type of egos are not just vulnerable, but fragile and hyper-defensive. At birth, the child's unconscious is connected with the unconscious of the mother, and this is called the pre-ego state of infancy. The baby makes no distinction between the inside and outside, the mother and the self, so the ego and the self is experienced as one. As the ego starts separating from the true self, the child's psyche leaves the paradise or the Garden of Eden, and the world is increasingly experienced as a realm of tension. Just think about a child that has never left the safety of home or the primary caregiver and have to start to go to a kindergarten or a preschool where the child is bullied or where negative things are said to the child, or the child is hurt or struggle to complete the tasks there. The normal ego self-access only develop where there's a normal development and a good enough mother-child bond. Let's think a bit or talk a bit about the whole concept of rupture and repair. If a child is not fully accepted after punishment by the parents, the ego will be caught up between alienation and inflation, and this leads to feelings of frustration and despair. When permissive parents, and we know that permissive parents never say no, the child can do whatever the child wants. In those cases, the child's ego stays inflated. It's never humanized, and the child stay in the stance of I can do whatever I want and the whole world surrounds me. And that's the typical egocentricity of a child between 18 months and 3, but need to be humanized by the boundaries and limitations of the parents. Now, when the permissive parent never say no, the child's inflation of the ego is accepted by the parents, and the ego of the child becomes disidentified and disconnected from the true self. So on the one hand, if there is no repair after boundaries, the child will be caught up in extreme feelings of rejection and abandonment. For example, if a parent gives the child a silent treatment for 3-4 days after the child misbehaves. On the other hand, if the parent is permissive and there is no healthy boundaries, the ego inflation of the child is accepted, and that inflated ego stays within the psyche of the child. A healthy connection between the ego and self is important for psychic health. It gives foundation, structure, and security to the ego. And the opposite of this healthy ego development in a child is chronic feelings of despair and meaninglessness. And what we often see in kids that have poor ego formation is once they start, for example, with primary school, they struggle to fit in, they struggle to master the task, they have poor social skills, and they are very much prone to anxiety, depression, and meltdowns. The first great task in life is the development of a strong ego. The ego needs to be differentiated from the self and freed from the unconscious of the parents. And that is a lifelong task. A sign of a lack of a well-formed ego is a child's ego that easily fragments under stress. And this is your kids that get a lot of meltdowns when they are confronted with a situation that is too stressful. These kids tend to resort to primitive and powerful defenses to wall off the world and to protect their psyche and the fragile part inside from possible intrusions and more trauma and injury. Now, when a child is growing up in a dysfunctional family that is unpredictable, The contradictory feelings and the lack of feelings of security in the family life seriously disrupt the development of a healthy ego. What we will see in the psyche of this child is a lack of trust in others and the world. The environment is often perceived as overwhelmingly threatening, and we see that in sand trays of children, where a fragile person might be put in the middle of the sand tray with a lot of threatening animals and demons and dragons and ghosts around that person, or a house, which is often seen as a symbol of the ego, is put in the center with a lot of threatening aspects around that. And the child might even tell a story that explains how that either the house or the broken house or the fragile human figure or animal or a baby animal is threatened by all these monsters around. We will also see a child with a lack of a well-formed ego will start withdrawing from the environment, might live in this defensive isolation, don't want to take part in normal childhood activities. A structure, organization, clarity, fluidity, and relational qualities will be absent, for example, in the child's sand scene. Often the child's sand story will look like a much younger child's age. So you might see in the sand tray of a teenager that there is still a lot of fantasy figures that would relate to a much younger age. Sometimes a child's ego is so overwhelmed that the child can't even start with, for example, sand tray work or making a drawing. They will start making a drawing, keep rubbing it out, being very perfectionistic, feel that it's not right, sometimes even get a meltdown because of that. Or the child will walk up and down in terms of the sand figurines and just can't decide what to do or what to pick. Often sand scenes that depict any type of chaos also refer to a poor ego structure. We also see the chaos in the sand scenes of children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, so we just need to distinguish there. Now, that I've just discussed signs of a very poor ego formation, but we also need to look at what lead to low ego strength. So any child's ego strength can be lowered when stress is experienced. For example, when parents are busy in a divorce, high conflict divorce, or when there's a movement, a huge transition like moving from primary school to high school. And the low ego strengths need to be distinguished from the negativized rigid ego, because with a development of a negativized ego, the wounding took place before the ego was formed at about age 3.5 of the centroversion. A low ego strength is where there was already ego formation as when the adversity or the trauma or whatever is leading to the low ego took place after ego formation. When a child reaches school age, the phase of building up the ego and adapting to the outer world begins seriously. And this sometimes brings a painful shock to the child. Some children realize, for example, that they are very different from other kids, and that brings loneliness and sadness. And children need to learn to cope with their inner impulses and impulse control, as well as the demands of the outside world by this time. When the development of consciousness is disturbed in the normal unfolding, children retire from the inner or outer difficulties to an inner fortress or a self-care system. Trauma can then be considered as severe pain that swallows the child's normal developmental processes, leaving an abyss between the self and the world. Through trauma, the child's psyche forms a self-care system that consists of an interlocking set of self and object representations, an inner child and its protective and persecutory guardian, as discussed in a previous podcast. The self-care system has enormous resistance to change during the therapy process. It will not give up its control without the child having an experience in which the lost child, the child, the deep essence, true self of the child that is hiding, is reached and helped. This will not happen before the child experiences emotional safety in the therapeutic relationship, and that can take a long time. In the next podcast, I am going to discuss the functions of the self-care system, as well as how to realize, how to observe the possibility of the self-care system in the unconscious of a child through the child's drawing, sand tray, work, puppetry, and so forth, how that can be seen in the child's play and how that often play out. Thank you for joining me today.